This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Gary Smith.
Okay, for all of you doubting Thomases out there who have said we've stopped doing midweek, we've got a special midweek because we have a special guest, none other than Ashleigh Banfield, who you can watch nightly. There you are, Ashleigh. You can watch her nightly on NewsNation. I believe 10 o'clock Eastern, which is much more civilized when I join your show because it's 7 o'clock Pacific.
Unless you're in New York.
Yeah. Or, Ashleigh, you are starting your own podcast, correct?
I am, yeah. Thursday the 24th is the big drop date, and it's taken a year to put this together. It's actually a really big project, believe it or not.
Wow. 1 year. Well, look, I've been in love with you since 20 whatever years ago when you were the breakout star on after 9/11, and then you've kind of taken over the world since then, and now you've decided you're going to take over the podcast world. So tell me, what's it about? Because I'm going to guess true crime.
It is true crime. Absolutely. That seems to be my wheelhouse over the last 30 years or so. I'm launching a 6-part series on the launch date. And after the 6-part series runs, then I'll be doing something every single week with top newsmakers like you. And but this first series has taken me a long time, and it's very near and dear to my heart and very difficult to tell because it's about a prolific sex criminal who, if you were to take Epstein, Weinstein, Cosby, Diddy, and sort of throw them all together, Peter Nygård would dwarf those numbers. And I grew up with Peter Nygård. I called him Uncle Peter. He was my best friend's uncle, and I spent quite a lot of time with him, and he was very close to my family. And Garagos, he was such a trip. He was like...
I just want to, because the comments section is going to be off the charts that you have an Uncle Peter who is a prolific sex predator. So we'll just start there. Wait, and for those who don't know, let's start at the end. Where is Uncle Peter now? And then I'm going to ask a couple of questions.
So Uncle Peter is now officially in prison, and he was convicted and jailed and then moved to a prison all in the year 2024. But the sex crimes happened over 50 years, and he still has 3 more criminal trials, one in Montreal, one in Winnipeg, one in the Southern District of New York, and then a massive civil suit. About 135 people at last counted signed on to the civil suit. Presumably 2 of those people are his 2 sons.
Wow. And you never saw, how long did you know him, and at what age do you first come in contact with him?
So Angela was my childhood best friend, and we became really tight at around age 12, 13. And so I spent a lot of time in her house, and, and her mother was like my mother. They were both business tycoons. And so Uncle Peter loved his sister and really loved my mom because they were both very, very astute in business. And he never hit on my mom, thank God. And he never hit on me either. But later in life, he had a real predilection for young girls, like down to the 13, 14, 15 years old. And Garagos, you'll understand this because we're of a certain generation. But back in the 70s and 80s, if you were like Hugh Hefner, it was like a badge of honor. And nobody would ask questions about you showing up with 5 women on either arm, scantily clad. You were the man. And if you, as a woman, if you said anything, certainly as a young person, you were the buzzkill, So that times were very different. And I think he got a hell of a pass because he was a rags to riches story. And I mean rags. I mean, he showed up with a steamer trunk, and became a billionaire.
How did he, I would tell the people who don't know how he made his money.
Yeah. So another amazing story. He showed up here from Finland with his parents and his sister, and they lived in a coal shack in southern Manitoba in Canada, where it's minus 40 in the winter. That's how I grew up. And they had a small fireplace, a stove in the middle of their shack, and an outdoor toilet. I mean, it was a real poverty story of immigrants who, worked hard. And he particularly started a clothing empire for women who were entering the workplace in the 70s, because men wouldn't give their wives money to buy clothes for the office, and they needed something that was washable because nobody would allow them a dry cleaning budget, right? So he came up with these wardrobes that if you bought 5 pieces, you'd have clothes for the whole week and look different every day. It was brilliant. And it was all polyester. So he's kind of known as the polyester king in Canada. But he made, I think he sort of scraped the top echelons of billionaire, just getting there. But all the way along from the 50s on, he was a sex predator. And we all thought he was just a ladies' man, because ladies' man wasn't a bad word.
Right. Trust me, I remember. And it's funny you mentioned kind of the litany of people. Harvey Weinstein used to say, part of the defense was back in the 70s, it was a different era. Back in the 80s, it was a different era.
And I hate to say this, in a way it was. The mens rea is what we're all about, right?
Right.
And so a lot of these men didn't think it was wrong because nobody said it was wrong, and women were too afraid to say it was wrong. And women were too afraid to mention that they'd been in a compromising situation, even if it was forced on them, because it would be blamed on them. So because it was just a terrible spiral that no one could ever, spiral up from. Men didn't necessarily think it was wrong. Now, Peter had to know it was wrong because he was forcibly raping a lot of these women violently and tearing clothes and that kind of thing. So it's wrong at that point. But I think there was such a gray area. And I do have a sympathy for a lot of cases that came out of that era, because it changed very fast. And there were those sacrificial, I'm not going to call them lambs, but they were sacrificial public figures that really kind of chastened the rest of society. Like, Jesus, I guess you can't say those words and do those things. Many people thought you could and thought you'd be a hero if you were the ladies' man.
It's so interesting you talk about Hugh Hefner, because, boy, the Hugh Hefner, as here in LA at least, when you're growing up, and the kind of lionization of him, if you will, and then fast forward now and kind of the retrospective, and history has not been, how should I say, kind to him in the least. It's just
Well, guess what? So because I'm so close to the Nygard family, Angela, my best friend growing up, has opened the vault, and I have pictures, videos, letters.
When your thing drops, are we?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, yeah, I had to digitize a lot. I mean, there's naked buffets of women. It's just, oh God. But one of the artifacts that is so fascinating is a letters back and forth from Peter Nygård to Hugh Hefner. And they were tight, they were pals because same ilk. And I guess at some point, and I'm dying to find out what happened, but at some point, Hugh wrote Peter a breakup letter, basically saying, "You're too much for me." And then Peter wrote Hugh back saying, "But we're such good friends and we have such a good relationship. And I hope you'll find it in your heart to bring me back into your fold," because clearly Peter had been to the Playboy Mansion a lot, and he modeled his life and his world and his architecture after the Playboy Mansion. So every one of his layers was that. It was like a sex lair. There were secret hideaway places that were very rapey and locked from the inside.
Wow. And did Angela cooperate? I assume, what's her story right now? How does she deal with all this?
Ange has had the shit life. And, she had a baby at 17, and I went off to college, and she went off to college and had to drop out. And for whatever reason, she decided to carry on with life as a single mother at 17. But she'd grown up in this very twisted culture where Peter's world was normal. All these women and stuff going on in their home. I mean, they all had shared a summer home together. And so the women would be and if the women were there, you couldn't knock on the door, you couldn't go near that cabin. And it was just gross. So I think Angela.
That's interesting, because one of the things with Jose Menendez, as you know, because you and I have talked about this, is the hallway rule, where Kitty enforced that nobody could go down the hallway if Jose was with either Lyle or Aaron. So Nygard had the same kind of a rule?
It was a strict rule, and it was enforced by Nygard's parents and his sister, Angela's mom. So they just knew that there were always women there. He was never without at least 2 or 3, and he slept with all of them. Like there was like beds that were really big that they could have all these. Anyway, but yeah, and so the rule was
Don't tell me it was a waterbed. I was just I saw something the other day.
I had one of those,
and I remember, and I was saying, whatever happened to waterbeds? I really
had one. God, that's an 80s thing. But so Angela grew up thinking like that was a woman's place, right? It wasn't weird. And so when she got pregnant, Peter, easily made her feel like, well, you're working for me because you'll never have any options, and that's just your fault. And I had no idea back in the day she had been raped by a 35-year-old man at age 17.
Somebody who knew her dad?
No, it was somebody she met in a bar. Ugh. And yes, and she thought it was her fault, of course, Back then we didn't think that was rape, we didn't realize statutory rape wasn't really something everybody talked about, and you'd be in trouble. If you were in the bar, the drinking age was 18, not 17. And so anyway, so she went to work for him because he had this very successful clothing empire. And what else was she going to do? She had a baby, she had to bring the baby to work.
What was the clothing? Was it a retailer?
Yeah, he had his own brands called Nygard, Bianca, Aaliyah. He had a giant office right in Times Square with a massive billboard of himself. And he sold in all the major retailers like Saks, like he was everywhere. And again, it was inexpensive stuff that was washable, and, working women could really afford this stuff. So it was a brilliant business idea. But of course, he used his clothing empire to say, oh, you need to be a model, and so almost everyone was lured with the promise that they'd have some big modeling career. And then, of course, there were a lot of the women, and this will also sound crass and mean, and there'll be comments and all the rest, but unless you lived through the 70s and 80s and 90s, you won't understand it. There were a lot of hangers-on. There were a lot of women that wanted to be in that world no matter what. And if it meant having sex with him at his demand on the plane or anywhere or in his office, which is where so many of the rapes happened in his offices, then they just did, And so a lot of his cover was because people assumed that it was someone spurned. So if they complained, it was somebody spurned and they just want money. And everyone believed that back then. Like that was the default position. If somebody cried rape, they must have wanted something. They want money. They want revenge. They weren't going to be the next Mrs. Nygard. And so even his family believed that anybody who complained, and there were so few who complained out loud, were liars. Now we feel different.
When did you turn? Or what turned you?
What turned me? Oh, the arrest and the affidavits. I just about died. Oh, God.
Leading up to that, nothing?
No, I always thought he was just skeevy, like it wasn't my cup of tea. I didn't want that life. I used to say to my mom all the time, like, what the hell is with Uncle Peter? Like, why won't we get married and settle down? He had children by all these women. And Mom said, Peter was married in the 60s for a hot minute and they'd never had kids. And he said, that's not for me. And so he just wanted to be Hugh Hefner. But I mean, Hugh Hefner was married? So that was what Peter wanted. It was that exact model. And I just thought it was gross, but not illegal. And when the affidavits came out in 2020, when he was arrested, holy shit. I mean, the filth and the kink and the stuff that he was doing, the young women and the feces and all these awful things. It was almost too much to believe. And that's when Angela turned as well. And Angela worked for him. So you know how it works, right? Anybody who works for someone, well, you have to be a sex trafficker. If you ever bought an airline ticket, or if you're an assistant, knowingly or unknowingly is how the federal law is worded. You can be squeezed like a lemon. And she said, you don't have to squeeze me. I'll tell you anything you want. For Christ's sake, I'm not a sex trafficker. That's him.
Did they do that to her?
Yeah, they did. They really did. And that's why she didn't talk to me until this, just this last year, because she had to stay quiet. The Southern District said, like, we're working with you on this and you have to meet with us and tell us everything and open the vault. And she said, I'm happy to. I feel like this guy's ruined my life too. I mean, he abused her so much, Garagos. She's got some phone calls that she recorded and I air them in the podcast and I listen to them and I just think, I can't imagine anyone speaking to anyone that way, let alone your family. Just the cruelty and the mental abuse, calling her an idiot, an effing idiot, you're the stupidest, screaming at the top of his lungs. And sometimes the screaming sessions would last for 6 hours. That's how abusive he was. And she quit like 3 times. And then the family would suck her back in saying, you're not loyal to the family if you leave. And she was broke, and she's still broke, working for this billionaire for 30 years. He paid her $25 an hour and capped her at 8 hours, even though she worked 20-hour days,
Wow. Did you, and has she, what about her? Is it a daughter or a son?
So my best friend is a daughter. It's Angela, and she has 3 children, and they worked for the industry as well. And they were broken by all of this. Wow. When he was arrested, and a lot of it was in Marina del Rey in Los Angeles, her whole community, got wind, and there was stuff leaked out of the affidavit. And they started calling Angela and her kids sex traffickers, and she lost her job, and the kids were ostracized and lost all their friends. And they just had a really, really horrible last 4 years. And she will be the first to say, nowhere near what the rape victims have suffered. But Ange is her whole life has just kind of collapsed. Wow. Because of Peter.
And by the way, where can we get, now you've intrigued me, I'm going to go listen to it. Where do we get your podcast?
So the podcast is Drop Dead Serious. That's my podcast brand, Drop Dead Serious. And it's on all of the platforms, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can get it. And then also YouTube. I've got the full video component because there's so much stuff. Oh my God, Garagos, there's this one tape that she gave me from Peter's vault. Literally his safes all had to be open. And this video is like, you can't write this stuff. It's in the Bahamas, where many of his rapes happened. At the end of Lifer Key, he had this massive $70 million Swiss Family Robinson home, right? Just like, it was crazy. It looked like the Swiss Family Robinson meets, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which he was on multiple times. On this video, he used to have all these swingers parties. He'd fly people out every week for these swingers parties. And it's an awards ceremony for the swingers week. And they're all like half naked and standing. And he's like up there handing out the award, like for the woman who tagged everybody. And she's like, yeah. She comes up and gets her award topless. And oh God. And they're all like so into this lifestyle, right? Power to them. It's just that a lot of it went sideways in side rooms, dark rooms, locked rooms, and there was a lot of drugging that went on.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to bring you back after I do. Or I'm actually going to watch it on the YouTube. Gary will embed one of the titillations episodes in here, and I will see you on NewsNation, Ashleigh.
The trailer's out now. You can go to dropdeadserious.com, and you can see the trailer now. Either listen to it or watch it. And then on Thursday, the 23rd of January was my big day. So that's when 2 big ones drop, and then one will drop every week after that, and then we'll talk, and I'll get you on to get your take on it.
I'd love it. Thank you, Ashleigh. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me on, Garagos. You know how much I love you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Reasonable Doubt. Subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Reasonable Doubt Podcast.